standing in a very wonderful portrait here, aren't we?
This is a photo of my father in his uniform after he came back from World War I. You can see he's got the battalion colours of light blue and navy blue on his shoulder. His epaulette bears his rank of lieutenant. He's got his cap on, and the badge there I still hold. That was his original badge that he actually wore at the landing of Gallipoli. It saw all the way through the war. It's a little bit bent out of shape. Whether that happened in the shrapnel blast or not, I don't know, but it's developed a slightly converse shape over the years. I've still got one of those pips which we took back to Gallipoli, and some of the buttons off his tunic.
So all in all, Brian, how long was your dad involved from? Obviously, he landed at Gallipoli, and then he was back in early 18. Is that correct?
In early 1918.
Early
yeah.
1918.
But in those days, you couldn't resign your commission. So during the Second World War, when Dad was the manager of the Commonwealth Bank in Rockhampton, he was seconded from the bank to be the area officer commanding Central and Northern Queensland, which basically was a recruiting role for that part of the world. So he did that in World War II, as well as being involved in War Loans Committees, Legacy Rotary, and every other community event that the Red Cross at Rockhampton was very much forefront. It was straight across from us, where the bank residence was, lived the US General, and there was quite a good affinity between my father and the US General, and there were a lot of American troops stationed in Rockhampton during the Second World War years.
So was he enlisted in World War II? No.
No, he was seconded.
He was seconded?
Yes. He was unfit for military service.
Because of the shrapnel in the shoulder?
Well, that's why he came back to Australia. He was boarded, sent home as military unfit for service, could not serve in an active front again, but again wanted to do something for his country. And well, I don't know whether he wanted to, but he was just seconded by the army to do it. And I know the bank wasn't particularly happy at that stage because it cost them a bit of money to relieve him while he was doing this military role.
Brian, we've got your dad's diary here from Anzac Day, or well, April 25th, 1915, and it actually notates his arrival and landing on that day.
That's correct. He says, left boat at 10 p.m, landed at 3 a.m, and straight into action. First task was to carry ammunition about 2 miles up a mountain into the firing line. It was a terrible task and we had to accomplish it before daybreak. We succeeded, but were sickened by the sight of dead and wounded en route.
That's truly a graphic picture, so vividly written by your dad, that really brings back the horrors of what that first day was, of which we now hold so dearly in Australian history. Okay, Brian, now we're actually, we've got one of Lewis's diaries here, haven't we? This is from 1917?
1917.
And this is where he was wounded, and this is his diary events.
With the 7th of June 1917, left Vauxhall Camp, Veuve Église, at 11:36 tonight to go into close reserve on Hill 63. Had an easy trip but heavily laden, arrived 2:30. Slept in open trenches on duckboards today. Heavy bombardment all night, went up to Messines today and had a look around old trenches, etc. Terrible havoc wreaked by our artillery. Saturday night, moving up to Blackline tonight to relieve first bucks. Heavy artillery fire both sides. This afternoon saw Herb Higgins on way up to Gooseberry Farm. Just completed relief when a piece of shell went through my right shoulder. Very painful. Reached dressing station about midnight. Still waiting for nearly 12 hours in a shell hole while shells were raining. Wound and bleeding like a pig. I got carried out and reached CCS at about 4 p.m. Very bad night and much pain, still bleeding. Left at 9 p.m. tonight for number 3 General Hospital, transport, cosy trip down on train.
So, Brian, this was when he was wounded in the shoulder, and that's the piece of shrapnel that he carried with him for the rest of his life, virtually?
That's correct.
And again, he kept really good diaries, didn't he?
The diaries are very good. They're very hard to read now. They've faded, and you can see I was having to use a magnifying glass to be able to read it. But again, to have these diaries is an amazing memento. And
to think that, you know, like a lot of people, I think, speaking to a lot of young people, they think that World War I was, the soldiers were there and they were there 24 hours, but they actually were rotated a whole lot. The British learnt very quickly early in the piece that they could not keep the soldiers there all the time, so they were rotated a lot. So the soldiers got a chance to go back to the quiet places, and they wrote their diaries, obviously.
Yes, and some of them were written in the trenches. But it's interesting, we were chatting before, you know, the diet consisted very largely of apricot jam and bully beef. And to his dying day, my father wouldn't eat canned beef or apricot jam.
He didn't like it at all.
He didn't like that at all, no. He reckoned he'd had enough of that for 4 years, so that was off the agenda.
Well, the conditions would have been horrific, though, in terms of the food and everything as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they didn't have the rations developed to the extent that they do today.
And they had to bring them all up to the front line from rear guard to bring them up, didn't they? So if the soldiers were there hanging out for a feed,
the logistics would have been
quite bizarre. And the trenches were just sort of, you know, like he mentioned there about going into a trench and just on the duck boards.
Yes. And that's where they got to sleep. And
Belgium, it was also very wet.
Yes.
So it would have been quite horrific. Did he talk about the conditions like trench foot or anything? Did you ever hear him mention them, anything like that? Or
no, but he did, as I said before, he got pleurisy and pneumonia, and that necessitated a fairly extensive stay in hospital.
Okay, we're with Mr. Brian McIntyre today, and he has an amazing historical story about his dad to tell us, and we'd like to share some moments with you. And maybe, Brian, we might start off with you just telling us a bit about your dad, what you remember of him, and maybe his experience.
Yeah, well, my father was one of nature's gentlemen. He grew up on a farm at Jasper's Brush, south of Berry in New South Wales. Took a position with the Commercial Bank of Australia at a young age, then left that bank and went to Gloucester in New South Wales, where he worked as a stock and station agent. It was from there that they were calling for volunteers, and on the 21st of September 1914, my father enlisted at Victoria Barracks in Sydney for service in World War I, and he was subsequently drafted into the 13th Battalion, and his regimental number was 418. From there, and we'll talk more about the war history later, but on return from the war, Dad came back and joined the Commonwealth Bank as one of the very early people in that bank, and he worked throughout Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. He was always very heavily involved in the community, being a Rotarian, and his true love was legacy. He joined Sydney Legacy in the very early days, and on his transfer to Brisbane became a founding member of Brisbane Legacy, a role that I can proudly follow today.
Yeah. So Brian, when did he leave Australia? When did he actually leave Australia? Did he leave with the battalion from Perth?
From Albany
Yep.
in Perth. He was on a troop ship, and I remember him telling me one little story that the first casualty occurred on that troop ship, which had timber decking planks about 6 inches thick, and somebody underneath was cleaning their 303 weapon, and it accidentally discharged, went all the way through the 6 inches of plank and lodged in the buttocks of one of his co-soldiers. So that was the first casualty from World War I when they were on their way to training in Egypt.
So he spent a bit of time in Egypt, obviously,
yes.
And he obviously, there would have been some amazing stories of his time there as they prepared. And then he headed off to Gallipoli.
Yes. He's very proud of the fact that he was an original Anzac. His battalion, the 13th, landed in 2 waves. The first wave on the 25th of April 1915 landed shortly before midnight, and the second wave about dawn the next morning, and Dad was in the first wave. Mm-hmm. So he's very proud of that fact. And
did he tell many stories about that first experience of him at Gallipoli?
I have his diaries, Michael, and written in his diary is that was the most traumatic day of his life. It was his first exposure to fire. The noise apparently was horrific, with the cannons and the naval guns from both the Turks and the Allied forces creating an immense din. And the actual landing itself, when they got into the troops, the Turks waited a little while and then started shooting, and his battalion suffered about 50 casualties as they were landing. Dad, unfortunately, was not one of those. However, he was wounded quite badly with shrapnel in an exploding shell. He was, in fact, talking to his major, and the shell actually decapitated the major, who dropped dead, and Dad went to grab him and found he couldn't move his left arm because lodged in his left shoulder was this piece of shrapnel, and it was so close to his heart it stayed there till his dying day. Wow. They couldn't remove it.
And so those initial days were obviously so incredibly hard, and they stuck in his mind as memories that you can remember the stories that he told about those days.
Like all people that have been through conflict, they're very reluctant to talk about it. And admittedly, I was born quite late in life. Dad was 54. I was born in the Second World War, so over 30 years after Gallipoli, and he'd not shown any signs of stress, but he just did not want to talk about Gallipoli, apart from 1 or 2 things that he mentioned. One was the fact that after he was wounded, and he was quite badly wounded, he was left with some Turkish casualties, and they separated him and allowed Simpson and his donkey to actually cart him down to the beach, and then he went across to Lemnos Hospital. And
he spent the time there, obviously?
He spent about 6 weeks there before he rejoined his unit, again back on Gallipoli. Back on Gallipoli.
And he was on Gallipoli until the final day?
Yes.
And he was part of the evacuation, obviously, back to Lemnos, and then back to the Middle East, to Cairo and to Egypt again?
Yes.
And then he headed, obviously, for the Western Front?
That's right.
And what were his movements there?
Well, he went to France, to Flanders, to Messines, to Bullecourt, his battalion was very, very active in that area. He was subsequently wounded again in 1917 in France, and that was quite a serious wound, and he was hospitalised for 90 days as a result.
Back in England then?
Yes.
Yes. So he would have went to a clearing station and then back across to England?
To England, where he was in hospital, and I gather during that time he met a nurse, and they became quite friendly, but she's not my mother, and they drifted apart, as so often happens in these times of conflict.
Well, it was very much though the time also, because these young men had no idea of what their future was.
None whatsoever.
They went with this. Do you think your dad went with the idea, when he first enlisted, was it a great adventure, as a lot of the common Australian mystique says?
I'm not sure that it was so much an adventure as a sense of duty, a sense of commitment, a desire to stop tyranny, and probably with an overall desire for peace, because he was a very peace-loving man.
I think probably he would have been like many other young men who experienced the sheer death at Gallipoli, and then ended up on the Western Front, and that was another story again where the trench warfare was so incredibly dramatic that these men, their ideas and their lifestyle changed very quickly. So when you talk about him going back to England and having a bit of a good time, that was almost something that, as I said, they had no idea of what tomorrow brought for them.
Quite true, and that was brought home very forcibly. Dad was one of 4 brothers that went away to the war. One of his brothers was killed the same day that he was wounded, and they were very, very close. That was brother Tom.
So Lewis is your dad, and Tom was his brother?
Yes.
And Tom was killed?
Tom was killed.
Yes.
Another brother, Ray, was killed. Ray was a signaller. And the other brother, George, escaped without a scratch. And I was looking at his records the other day in the War Archives, and I wasn't aware of the fact that he was awarded a military medal, yet he wasn't wounded, so he must have been fortunate to get...
For 4 brothers to go, that's, like in many small communities all over Australia, the youth of the town, many of them died during World War I, and for 4 brothers to go, that would have been quite a strain on their mum and dad also.
Huge strain, particularly on the mother, because the father died during the war years. And
so the 4 boys were away.
Well, Dad was one of 11. There were 2 girls and 9 boys, and 2 of them had left home beforehand. So the running of the farm, which was a dairy farm, was very much left to my grandmother, whom I never had the pleasure of meeting. And I think she was quite relieved when, as a result of his injuries, Dad was repatriated to Australia in early 1918, so that he was able to help out on the farm, which he did for a little while before he went and joined the Commonwealth Bank, as I said.
So did his brother, was he in the same battalion as his brother? Were they in the same...
They were in the same battalion. They were both in the 13th Battalion. That's brother Tom.
Yes.
But when they became commissioned, they wouldn't allow 2 officers to be in the same battalion. So Tom went to a sister battalion, the 45th, which was very close. And
they interchanged quite regularly too, didn't they?
There was a lot of interchange between the 2. Yes.
So was Lewis around, and was he aware immediately of the fact that Thomas had died?
No.
Not at all?
He wasn't aware. He got a letter from his mother after his mother got the telegram, and she wrote a rather poignant letter, which I have a copy of, to Dad, saying that Tom had been killed.
And see
whether Dad knew beforehand or not until he got that letter, I don't know.
That's an amazing thing, that here they are both on the Western Front somewhere as brothers. The 4 brothers are there, and one of them passes away, and yet Mum has to tell the son that he has passed away. That must have been quite gut-wrenching, really, considering that, you know, many people, I suppose, think that, you know, Europe's, France and Belgium aren't big places, but the Western Front was not a big place. It was only, you know, like the trenches were a long way sort of stretched from the ocean down to Switzerland, but they were quite close in terms of where the battalions and everything were in the fighting. But it was hard to believe, I suppose, that they wouldn't have known what would have happened as time went on.
The communications between the battalions
very difficult.
They were there really fighting a war, not in the business of communicating losses with each other. And I think they probably didn't want to talk too much about the losses for fear of demoralisation with the balance of the troops. So I think they kept those things fairly. So
where did Tom fall?
He actually fell in France. I'm not entirely sure where, but he is on his plaque is on the Messines.
On the Messines Gate.
Yes.
So he fell in.
Ray.
So he fell in France.
Yes.
And Ray fell in France also. So both of them were in France, unknown, no graves, and they are remembered on the Messines Gate, where there's some 50,000.
That's right.
Remembered, and that is quite an amazing thing in itself, that so many of them are lost. But when you walk around the headstones, as you've been there and seen, so many of them have no known grave. It must have been horrific, and those stories from Lewis when he came home must have been something that, you know, like, as you said, he didn't speak much, but he obviously had it within him. And do you think it affected him?
Look, as I said before, he was 54 when I came on the scene, so I probably can't remember much for the first 6 years of my life. There was never an obvious sign to me that he'd suffered in any way as a result of his war service, apart from the physical aspect of his injuries in his shoulder, his neck and his eyes. His vision was not particularly good as a result of being wounded there. He didn't show any signs of what we today refer to as post-traumatic stress. He was not an angry man, he was not a bitter man, and my mother certainly never gave me any indication that Dad was depressive or anything of that nature, and I didn't see that side of it.
Because in your role within Legacy also, as you know, the post-traumatic stress is a really big issue today, and after World War I, it wasn't really something that was known a lot about, was it?
Michael, I think those of us who've never been involved in a military conflict simply cannot understand what these guys went through. It must affect them. But I think the vintage of World War I were, you know, toughen up, boy, get on with your life and live it, learn to live with it. And there wasn't the help available that there is today. We're seeing incidences of increased suicides, both out of Afghanistan and certainly out of, even to this day, out of Vietnam, which didn't appear to be as great from the World War I, World War II veterans. I know the conflicts are different. They all knew who their enemy was. But, Michael, you know, hand-to-hand bayonet combat wouldn't be easy. And I recollect that early in his career in the bank, Dad was confronted by a person who walked behind the bank counter and started flicking through the ledgers. And Dad said to this bloke, "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm looking up the balance of my account." And Dad said, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, you can't do that. You go back out the front there and wait like everyone else, and when I get to you, I'll be able to give you your balance of your account." And this bloke said, "No." He said, "If I want to look up my balance of my account, I'll look up my balance of account." And Dad said, "Don't give me a hard time, sport." He said, "I've killed better men than you before breakfast. Now get back in that queue." And the bloke said, "A young fellow, you should get to know who the general manager of the bank is."
Oh, wow, what an amazing story that was.
Now that's the only comment he has ever made that suggested
A little bit of...
Yes, and that was very much immediate post-war, so it was well before I was born.
Did you lose many mates?
Yes, although the battalion reunions were very strong. A lot of them, I can remember there's one fellow that only had one arm, who was a fellow lieutenant with Dad called Roy Gowing, and I remember that he used to drive a motor car, and to be able to drive in those days you had to give hand signals, so he had a mechanical hand signal that he could use out the side of his car. Yes, the battalion suffered very heavy casualties, both on Gallipoli and in France, in all ranks, but particularly in the young subalterns. They seem to have a very high casualty rate.
Your dad has an amazing story in that there are so many stories of men who went to Gallipoli and fell very quickly, and men who went to Gallipoli and survived the terror there and went to the Western Front and very quickly succumbed there as well.
Yes.
And your dad seems to have, given the fact that he lost two brothers and some mates, he was in the right place at the right time.
Oh, I think our friend above was looking after him, yes.
Yeah, but those are the stories that are quite amazing also, that within World War I, as with every war, it is amazing the stories of people who have obviously survived different conflicts, and in the face of incredible terrain and activities, they were able to survive that and then come home. And that truly is a legacy in itself.
Well, Dad was also hospitalised with pleurisy, and he had about 60 days, I think, his records. So it's interesting, you know, the records you've got in the Australian archives are fantastic. Dad's records cover 69 pages, and it's open. Anyone can look at it. You know, all you need to know is his name and his regimental number, and Bob's up on the screen, and you can go and have a good look at it.
The records available to Australians are quite amazing, and I think in this time of commemoration of the centenary of World War I, many people have had that opportunity to actually tell, or look up the stories. There are still so many stories out there, and that's one of the things, you know, like you are a living descendant so closely related, you know, that is still around, and that's very important that we're able to have those stories, because in many moons to come, yes, the memories will be there on the records, but to be able to hear it firsthand is something again.
Yeah, well, Michael, you know, I would be one of the younger first generation World War I people, and I was fortunate enough to go with my wife to Gallipoli in 2015 and be at Anzac Cove. We were fortunate enough to get a position in the ballot. And it was very interesting that they started asking about great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, grandchildren, and eventually got to the stage of children of original Anzacs. And to my great surprise, there was somewhere around about 50 to 60 people stood up in the stands at Lone Pine acknowledging that they were first-generation descendants. So there'd be many others who, of course, because of age, were physically incapable of making the journey. But I was quite surprised at that. But you're right, with the effluxion of time, the stories will become distorted and memories will fade. And that's why I treasure the diaries and all the memorabilia that I've got.
Now, Brian, we're sitting down with some memorabilia here. Would you like to just explain a little bit about a few of these things of your dad's?
Certainly. The first photo that we have here is in camp in 1914. Now, I have no idea who it is. It's interesting that they weren't even in military uniform, so I'm assuming it was in Australia before they went overseas, just after the formation of the battalion.
And that was in Victoria, wasn't it?
No, that was in Sydney,
That was in Sydney?
New South Wales,
Yes.
where that came from, yeah, in 1914. Underneath is a photo of my dad.
He was a good-looking man.
Yes, he was. It's something I didn't inherit. And we were speaking before about the 4 McIntyres that went. The top here we have Ray, and And the gentleman on the right is Tom, who was they were the two that were killed. Beneath is Ray, and you can see he's still got the signal as emblem on. Sorry, that's George below, yes. And there's Dad and Tom, who, as I said, were very, very close. That was taken after they were commissioned, as you can see there. So that's the thing there. I also have Dad's paybook, and it's interesting to see that for risking their lives,
what were they paid? Yeah, what were they paid, Brian?
2 shillings.
Per day?
He was paid 2 shillings net rate per day, and that was rounded up. And then by the time he became a lieutenant, he was on the princely sum of 15 shillings a day. So that's quite an interesting record. Here is the 13th Battalion emblem, which he was a member of. His original badge that he wore when he landed on Gallipoli, and these two accompanied us back to Gallipoli for the 100th centenary, as did one of Dad's pips. We've only got one pip there. I guess probably this one takes pride of place on our mantelpiece at home. It's the Simpson Donkey medal. It's the inscription of his name on the back and the map of Australia and the star, and that was awarded to all original Anzacs. The medals are the standard medals of World War One, but Dad also has the Medal of the Somme, which is the little one over on the left there.
Do the other members of the family have his brother's medals as well?
I'm not aware of that. I don't know what happened to anything that Tom or Ray had. George's family would certainly have had some of his, but again, because our career was very nomadic, we lost contact with a lot of our relatives, and
some of the amazing things in the War Memorial, there are some truly poignant letters from mothers asking for medals or asking for scrolls of memory that they never received, or they may have gone astray, and it took many, many years for many families to actually feel some sense of worth by having those. And it's amazing also when you look around some of the various sites on the internet these days, the medals that are for sale, that no one has any idea of who they were from and everything. And it's quite sad that, you know, it's a wonderful thing that you actually have something that, as you said, you can pass on, that will actually take that memory on, whereas there are many memories out there that have just been, and again, it may come back to the fact that when they came home, they didn't want to talk about it, and there was no longer something they wanted to remember.
You're right, I think that's probably it, but isn't it a tragedy, Michael, that there's nobody to care for these? I mean, these are priceless to me.
Yes. The Somme medal certainly is an interesting one as well, isn't it?
It is, because that wasn't awarded till fairly late in the piece. July 1956 that was issued, yes. So it came quite some time after the event. The photo there is one of my father and mother at their wedding, and the book, The Fighting 13th, is a history of the battalion, which again, it was one of the original ones. I've just got in the front of it a couple of pieces of memorabilia about the uncles.
And the men in Gate where they are
remembered. But it's the book was published in 1924, and it was at that stage only available for members of the 13th Battalion.
Now, Brian, a question I would ask you also is, when you obviously you have a great deal of pride in remembering and passing on your dad's story and your uncle's stories really also. you've been to the Western Front. Having known the story, the first time you went, what were your feelings when you were there for the first time?
Extreme emotion.
Obviously, Gallipoli would have been, because you knew that where you were walking, your dad had walked, and maybe your uncle.
Gallipoli was probably the strongest, but even the Western Front started to make me choke up. As I thought, you know, what did we achieve out of all of this? You know, so much sacrifice, so much loss, so much drama, so much tragedy, and we still then allowed ourselves to drift into the conflict of World War II.
Quite amazingly, without any thought of what occurred.
Yes, and I mean, we're seeing tyranny in very different ways today, as we see the terrific exposure of terrorism throughout the world. And I guess it was terrorism, to a certain extent, that our early soldiers were trying to prevent.
When you stood at the Messines Gate, those two uncles that never came back, that are remembered there, another poignant moment?
I haven't actually visited the Messines Gate, so that's only photos that we've had. The tours we did of France didn't take in the Messines Gate for some reason. So
how do you feel knowing that you know those two uncles didn't come back, and that the only remembrance of them is on that wall? How do you think you'd feel if you actually had that opportunity to see their names written on that side?
Well, the only parallel I can draw is on the memorial wall at the War Memorial in Canberra. Their names are both recorded, and we've put red poppies there. So.
And in Berry?
Oh, and in Berry in New South Wales, where they were. You were saying before about the small communities and the people going. There's about 20 names on the War Memorial from Berry for those that went to the First World War, and there's 4 McIntyres. So a very significant contribution from one family from a very small community.
This is the centenary years over the next few years, and they're obviously a time to remember. Do you think that will continue?
We've seen a huge increase in the interest of Australians, particularly young Australians, at Anzac Day celebrations and commemoration. Anna and I were also fortunate enough to be at Gallipoli for Anzac Day in 2011, because Anna said, go while you can, Brian, you don't know what's going to happen, you may not be able to go for the 100th year. And the ground in front of us was littered with people in sleeping bags, all young Australians and New Zealanders that felt it was part of their rite of passage to visit Gallipoli. I think I cannot see it diminishing. I mean, it is such a vital part of the fabric of Australia that the younger people, I think, will continue to show an interest in Gallipoli in World War I and other conflicts subsequently.